Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a stack of sources in front of us. Articles from Fox News, PBS News, a Psychology Today piece, plus a historical timeline and some character info. And they're all sort of circling around this one phrase that's been, well, pretty loud in recent political chat. The enemy within.
It really is a phrase that grabs you, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, depending on who's saying it and who they mean, it carries some serious weight.
Totally. And this deep dive, it's really all about helping you, the listener, kind of cut through that noise.
Yeah, get to the core of it.
Exactly. We're going to go through these sources together, pull out the key bits, the surprising facts, the history behind it, the different ways people seem to be taking it, so you can feel, properly informed on what these materials actually say.
Think of us as guides, just looking at the source material you've given us. Our job here is to explore, where this phrase might come from, how it's popping up now,
right,
and what some experts and, public discussions in these sources are telling us about its meaning and maybe its impact.
Okay, sounds good. So let's dive right into the most current stuff, the usage that's presented in this material right now.
Okay.
According to the Fox News article, and that timeline source, former President Trump, has used the phrase enemy from within quite a bit, repeatedly.
That's right. And the sources, they show he's applied this label to, specific groups and people he sees as threats, often painting them as, really dangerous.
The Fox News piece is pretty stark on this. It quotes him saying this internal enemy is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries.
Wow.
Yeah. And he uses terms like lunatics inside.
Yeah, the sources give some solid examples.
Yeah.
Both Fox News and the timeline, they mention Adam Schiff specifically.
All right.
He's named as an enemy from within, and it's connected, in that rhetoric, back to the Russia collusion claims and Hillary Clinton.
And the timeline source notes his broader usage, too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Towards Democrats and what he calls the radical left lunatics.
Exactly. But, what's really kind of revealing is that Reddit thread you included in the sources. It gives us this fascinating little snapshot into how the public, or, at least a segment of the public online, is interpreting who else this phrase might cover.
Oh, the range in that thread is something else. Users threw out names like Nancy Pelosi, Mike Pence, even Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. But they also suggested it could mean the whole federal bureaucracy or the media, anti-capitalists, or just basically anyone who opposes Trump.
And there's that interesting little discussion point in there about immigrants.
Yeah, I saw that.
Some users pointed out Trump apparently said he was not talking about immigrants specifically with this phrase.
Okay.
But then others in the same thread were arguing, well, either he was or, regardless of what he said, many of his supporters hear it that way.
That really shows how a phrase can just kind of take on a life of its own, depending on who's listening.
Absolutely. That ambiguity seems key, judging by the Reddit source.
But let's talk about actions for a second, because these sources also mention potential actions, things proposed or discussed relating to this perceived internal enemy.
Yes, that comes up. The Fox News and PBS NewsHour articles, and the timeline too, they reference Trump suggesting the potential use of the military or the National Guard against this enemy from within.
Particularly if you were reelected, right?
Right, that's the context given.
And that PBS NewsHour piece is interesting because it shows that even within the Republican Party, there seem to be different views on using the military like that.
Yeah. How so?
Well, specifically in a related context, like at the border, which Trump has also linked to these kinds of internal threat ideas. The article mentions figures like Joe Wilson supporting the idea.
Okay.
But then others, like Mike Rogers, suggesting active duty troops aren't really the answer, or Roger Wicker saying, DHS should lead that effort.
I see. So some internal debate there, too.
Yeah, and Dan Crenshaw is quoted as being open to sort of whatever fixes the border. So it shows, even when the goal is framed as addressing threats, the how can vary, at least according to these sources.
Right. So we're seeing the phrase used now, often politically loaded, targeting certain groups, and connected in some of these sources to talk about potential state power, maybe even military force.
Okay, so that's the current picture painted by these sources. But here's where it gets, I think, really interesting.
The history.
Yeah, because while enemy within feels so, now, the actual idea, it has some deep historical roots. Let's pivot to the history presented in that timeline source.
Okay, yeah, the term fifth column is the big one highlighted there, isn't it? A direct historical parallel.
Yeah.
And it's got this very specific kind of dramatic origin story.
Totally. The timeline points to General Emilio Mola during the Spanish Civil War, 1936.
Right.
He was leading 4 columns of nationalist troops towards Madrid, and he supposedly said a 5th column of sympathizers was already inside the city waiting to help them.
And the source notes, Dolores Echeverri, La Pasionaria, Republican figure, actually played a big role in popularizing that term in the press. Gave it legs.
Right, spread the word. And then, wow, it really took off during World War II, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The timeline shows it just became this widespread fear across Europe, this idea of, internal sabotage or disloyalty by people seen as sympathizers or specific groups.
Like Nazi sympathizers, obviously, but also, tragically, groups like Japanese immigrants in the U.S. and the Philippines or the Sudeten German Free Corps in Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm. But there's a surprising little detail in the timeline, isn't there? That, post-war analysis often doesn't really back up the scale of those accusations.
Yeah, that struck me too. The fear was incredibly potent, maybe, sometimes more potent than the actual proven threat.
Exactly. It became this powerful tool for suspicion, for repression. And the timeline lists other examples through history too. Saddam Hussein using it for purges.
Yeah.
It'd be applied to Israeli Arabs, Western Muslims, even recently in British politics, Nigel Farage's comments, or Hamza Yousaf in Scotland reporting being smeared with it. It keeps coming back.
And the concept itself, this idea of separating internal threats from external ones, that's even older. The timeline points all the way back to Plato's Republic.
Ancient roots. And that connects to another really interesting historical tidbit from the sources.
The Lincoln quote.
Yeah, the Abraham Lincoln quote about destruction coming from within. The popular version, America will never be destroyed from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out, according to PolitiFact, cited in the timeline and Reddit, that exact phrasing is actually mostly false.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The source confirms Lincoln did say something very similar in sentiment about internal dangers being the biggest threat, way back in a speech in 1838.
Huh. That's a great example of how an idea sticks around, even if the exact wording gets a bit fuzzy over time.
Definitely. It just underlines how deep this fear of an internal enemy runs historically.
So, okay, we have the modern usage, the historical parallels. Now let's look at how some of your sources actually analyze this kind of language, its potential impact.
Right, the why does it matter part.
Exactly. The PBS News article features NYU history professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She offers a pretty compelling take on the modern usage.
She draws a direct comparison, doesn't she, between Trump's use of enemy within, rhetoric, and historical fascist language. It's a strong claim.
It is. And the source lays out her reasoning. She argues that authoritarian figures often use language deliberately to sort of condition people to see fellow citizens as enemies.
Right, creating an environment where violence might seem more justifiable.
Yeah. She points out that phrases like calling America an occupied country or talking about using the military against Americans, she argues this isn't just casual talk. She says this kind of language comes out of fascism and military dictatorships historically.
And she gives that specific example, that parallel mentioned in the article, comparing Stephen Miller's America is for Americans and Americans only remark to a 1939 Nazi rally slogan.
That's a striking comparison cited in the source. And her analysis also touches on the sort of practical implications, right? Mentioning the need for an infrastructure of repression, even camps, if mass actions like deportations were actually carried out, linking the words to potential actions.
Which raises a question about political language itself and how it's used. Ben-Ghiat, in the source, makes an interesting distinction.
What's that?
Between using language rooted in fascism versus simply comparing someone to a fascist.
Okay.
She argues that, say, Vice President Harris calling Trump a fascist is not the same type of rhetoric as the language Trump himself uses, like enemy within. She calls his rhetoric authoritarian projection.
Authoritarian projection.
Yeah, she describes it as a historical tactic where authoritarians accuse their opponents of being the real tyrants or threats, essentially to justify their own actions. The upside-down world, as the source puts it.
That's an interesting point about how language can be deployed strategically, analyzing the rhetoric itself.
Which kind of leads us nicely into a different perspective altogether, the one from the Psychology Today article.
Ah, the psychological angle. So, what's the take there, according to this source?
Well, this article puts forward a pretty powerful idea. That division, especially now, isn't just a political side effect. In our digital age, it's actually being, exploited.
Exploited? How?
It argues that tech platforms, the whole attention economy, they basically thrive on conflict and inflammatory stuff because it keeps us clicking, keeps us engaged.
So our fear, our anger, it's being monetized.
That's the argument in the source, yeah.
Yeah.
And it connects this to something called evolutionary mismatch.
Evolutionary mismatch, okay.
The idea is that our brains, they evolve for small tribal groups. They aren't really built for the sheer scale and complexity of the modern digital world.
So we're overwhelmed?
Sort of. It triggers our old tribal instincts, makes us super sensitive to perceived threats, to us versus them thinking in ways we might not even realize. The article suggests we've kind of accidentally built a world that pushes our buttons, makes us, quote, a little crazy.
Wow. Yeah, the article also points out this, deep paradox.
The shared suffering.
Yeah. That despite the huge political divide, people on all sides often share the same basic worries about the economy, the future, their kids.
Right. The article calls it shared suffering beneath our division. Both sides might be absolutely convinced the other side is ruining everything, but they're feeling similar anxieties about where things are headed.
And the analogy it uses is pretty stark, calling the digital world's effect on society like an autoimmune disorder.
Yeah, where the body's defenses basically turn inward and attack itself. It's a powerful image for societal division.
Definitely. And the piece hammers home the need for unity, right? Citing Jesus, Lincoln, John Adams on the danger of a house divided.
Arguing that tackling the really big threats, climate change, pandemics, things that don't care about party lines, requires a level of cooperation that this deep division just undermines.
And maybe the most sort of resonant point from that Psychology Today source.
The enemy within ourselves.
Yeah, that maybe the biggest enemy isn't them over there or even specific people within the system, but maybe it's, inside us, the fear, the tribalism, the hate that makes us see enemies everywhere, even in our neighbors.
Which brings us right back, doesn't it? Full circle to those multiple interpretations we saw in the Reddit source. Who is the enemy within today?
Exactly. Looking back at that Reddit thread now, after considering the history, the rhetoric, the psychology, you can really see why a phrase like this lands so differently for different people.
It's not just a list of political opponents anymore. It's tapping into all those historical fears, the way language frames things, even our own sort of psychological weak spots.
Yeah, the range of who people thought it meant specific politicians, sure, but also broad groups, the bureaucracy, cultural forces, even turning it back on the speaker. It shows how elastic and, powerful the phrase can be.
And that point some users made about the ambiguity maybe being deliberate.
Right, letting people project their own fears onto it.
Exactly. Or giving the speaker plausible deniability. That seems to fit with the rhetorical analysis we were just talking about. It's like a Swiss Army knife of political language.
So, thinking about all these different angles from your sources, the specific political use now, the historical echoes, the way the rhetoric is analyzed, that psychological dimension, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What does this phrase actually mean to you, the listener, when you hear it? And why does understanding all this baggage, all these potential meanings, even matter?
Well, I think it matters because recognizing the history, recognizing the psychological buttons that this kind of language pushes, it can maybe help us be a bit more critical when we hear it used today.
Yeah, understand its potential impact.
Right.
This deep dive, it's really taken us on quite a journey. From the current political arena where enemy within is being thrown around, all the way back through history with things like the fifth column, through the academic analysis of the rhetoric itself, and then into the psychology of why we get so divided.
It really highlights how just a few words, a short phrase, can pack in so much history, so much strategy, and so much, psychology.
Absolutely. So as we wrap this up, here's maybe one final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, drawing from all these threads.
Okay.
Given the long, often dark history of this kind of language and the psychological forces that seem to amplify division today, and just how many ways people interpret the enemy within, how might understanding all that help you navigate the political conversations you encounter?
Or maybe thinking about that Psychology Today piece. How do we get better at telling the difference between, healthy debate or disagreement?
Right.
And the kind of rhetoric that seems maybe designed just to stir the pot, to profit from turning us against each other.
Yeah. How do we spot the difference? Something to definitely consider. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.